Hi everybody and welcome to the channel. Today I'm going to do a brief-ish video on the current state of vaccines for COVID in the US. The reason I want to do that is so I can help other people in my position, so business leaders, as well as, from the individual perspective, understand what is going on and down the road help educate what options are with regards to which vaccines, what time, like essentially there's an end in sight. And so let's start to build what that looks like. But before we do that, we've got to get to where we're at. And that's what I'm covering today. So specifically, we're going to be talking about Operation Warp Speed. We're going to be talking about the different types of vaccines that are being developed. And then we're going to talk about the phase 1 rollout in the US. So to jump right into it, the Department of Health and Human Services partnered with the Department of Defense earlier this year to create Operation Warp Speed. Operation Warp Speed's objective is to first off to identify candidates that go into their vaccine portfolio, and then sponsor those candidates with some sort of financial compensation for. They're basically pre-buying vaccines and calling it sponsorships. And then they're overseeing the expedited processes that are being used to make sure that we get the vaccine as quickly as possible, which include running some things in parallel that normally run serially. And then ultimately, they want to get 300 million doses of a safe and effective vaccine to the US population. And then their goal was to have the first vaccines roll out before the end of 2020. And it looks like that's going to be possible. So to go through a little bit of how they do that, or how they do what they do. So initially they identified the vaccines that they wanted to sponsor. So we've all heard of the Pfizer vaccine, the Moderna vaccine, and several others that are currently in development that pop up on the news now and again. The Pfizer has been in the news the most recently because yesterday it had a hearing that was kind of like the final approval, and we'll get to that in just a second. So once they've identified them, they sponsor them, which means they give them the money for a specific set of doses, which is usually on the 100 million dose level. So for instance, Pfizer got 1.9 billion to sell or to develop and sell a vaccine to the US in 100 million doses, and with the option to purchase 500 million later. That's what that looks like. And so once they've identified and added a company to the portfolio, they oversee the process of development and manufacturing. And the reason they do this is because they're skipping some steps. So they still require them to go through like a phased trial approach. So phase 1 is usually a very small group. Phase 2 is a little bit of a bigger group. And then phase 3 is a gigantic group. But the biggest example of run things in parallel is while they're doing the phase 3 trials, they're also manufacturing the finished vaccine. So that means that if something turns up in the phase 3 trial, they've got to scrap it and start over. That doesn't appear to be the case with the Pfizer vaccine, but it's not officially approved as of right now, the 11th of December. Tomorrow it's likely going to be approved, and then that means that Monday they'll be able to ship. And that's the other piece of what the Operation Warp Speed is doing, is the reason they're allowing production in phase 3 is so distribution can begin immediately. And again, like I said, their intent is to get everything out as quickly and safely while still being effective. And from the stats that were put out, it looks like they've met all of their goals so far. So if you hear about Operation Warp Speed, that's what that is. And then the last piece, and this is where Pfizer's at, is they're applying for emergency use authorization licensure. And so a panel or a committee that's built of the FDA and the Department of Health and Human Services will ultimately approve or reject this based off of the scientific findings and the results from the last big trial, which Pfizer's put, or not the Pfizer, but I think it's the FDA has put out Pfizer's final results. And so we'll go more in depth in the individual vaccines in the future. This is just an overview. but it's looking good for the approval of the drug. And then, like I said, Monday, or as quick as Monday, people could start taking the vaccine. And we'll get a little bit into the phase rollout in just a little bit. But next, I want to turn to the types of vaccines that are going to be available. Initially, we've got mRNA vaccines, which stands for messenger ribonucleic acid, and RNA is it's a relative. A scientist is not going to like how I describe this, but it's a relative single helix, or it's a relative of DNA, except for its single helix. I may be messing that up. I probably should look that up, but I'm too stubborn at this point. And they change scientists change the amino acids in the actual RNA, inject it, and then it takes its work from there and produces what it has to. And we'll get into that in a little bit more in just a second. But the mRNA is brand new to vaccines. And so it's been around for a couple of decades with other types of countermeasures to different diseases and stuff like that. But as far as a vaccine goes, this is the first one. So before we get any further into mRNA, I want to talk about the conventional method. So the conventional method of development is to capture a live specimen of the virus and then produce a batch of weakened viri, who knows. And they do that by injecting it into eggs or to chicken eggs or to mammal cells. And once they've produced a batch of weaker viruses, they then couple that with different processes to kind of clean it up and remove as much of the potential danger as possible, because it still is the virus. It's just a weaker version of the virus. And essentially they develop it until they've got an antigen. And so for this particular conversation, an antigen is just a piece of the virus, or something that mimics the virus to trigger an immune response. So they create the antigen from a live virus. So every time they test it, every time they have to change labs, it's a physical process. So they have to make new batches for every trial. They have to physically ship the batches to different labs. And the shipping of a virus, as you can imagine, is very complex and very time consuming and all that stuff. So the overall traditional method to do vaccines is very slow. So knowing that coming into this, a lot of the companies like Pfizer and Moderna elected to go for an mRNA approach. And so Pfizer doesn't have the technology to do the mRNA. That's a company called BioNTech. And if I'm supposed to say it a different way, too bad. The N is capitalized and so is the T. So it's BioNTech as far as I'm concerned. They actually have the technology to encode the RNA, and then they take the information from Pfizer and do the edits there in the RNA. But I'm getting ahead of myself, because instead of having to deal with the live virus more than just once, so they capture a live virus, then somebody in a lab, it digitally encodes the virus. And what that means is they map it out digitally in a way that is sufficient for the production of a virus, or production of a vaccine. So for instance, like a person in a lab in North Carolina can encode the virus and then send it electronically to 10 different labs instantly. Then those 10 different labs can take that information and build either a vaccine or encode the vaccine into the RNA for the eventual delivery. So it doesn't use a live virus in the end. What it does is it makes your own cells produce the antigen that our immune system requires to recognize, attack, and ultimately defeat it. So we build our own immunization. I don't talk about this type of stuff a lot, so if I mess up terms and whatnot, please forgive me. Oh, also, if you high view type stuff, if you want to go in depth in any of these topics in the future, just let me know down in the comments, and then I'll try to make that happen when possible. So the mRNA vaccine is intramuscular, meaning they give you a shot right here in your arm. it goes into the cells that are in that site, or the injection site, and it makes those cells grow spike proteins. And they're not harmful at all, but they resemble a COVID vaccine, and our immune system is just like, whoa, 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 what's going on here? And they come, they attack it, they defeat it, but more importantly, they learn. So how well they learn is ultimately the discussion that we would want to be having, but we don't really know because there's no long-term studies of the efficacy of any of these drugs. So in the short term, we'll take Pfizer's for instance. 50% have the appropriate amount of antibodies after the first dose. 85% have the appropriate amount of antibodies after is either 30 or 90 days. And then 95%, and this is where you get that high number, 95% have the antibodies 7 days after the second shot. And so Pfizer initially changed the way they were reporting that because they went from the 85 number to the 95. And I don't know if it's from a marketing perspective that they did that, or for marketing reasons that they did that, or if they were changing the data to compare apples to apples with like a Moderna study where I believe, or no, it wasn't Moderna, it was AstraZeneca and Oxford University that put out some ridiculously high 95%. But I don't know specifics about that data. Like I said, I'll get more in depth in these in the future as they become more relevant. So next week I should have a Pfizer in-depth kind of video to talk about specifically what they did, what the side effects are, and things like that. So all that to say, there's no live antigens in the mRNA vaccine, and it appears as of this moment that it works just as well as the other vaccines. And so I find that to be an overwhelming positive thing, and more importantly, it brings the idea of a light at the end of this tunnel. And that's what I was talking about earlier when I said I wanted to make this video, because now as a business leader, I have a lot of decisions to make. I have a lot of things to think about, because every company is going to have to take an approach to bringing people back in. And so how do we deal with people who are inoculated versus not? And there's just a whole lot of questions. And then do we recommend it or not as an employer? We don't know. What we do know is that other entities like Ticketmaster and stuff like that are going to require something proving that you've been inoculated or that you are currently negative. And so this is going to be in our faces pretty soon, for sure. And then let's see. The only other thing about mRNA that I want to go into right now is the adaptability of the vaccine for future mutations is very easy to deal with. So they can take the current vaccine and adjust it to the new viruses pretty easy in relation to the old process, because the old process you have to start the whole thing over from scratch, because it's just using the live virus to recreate everything. So every new virus, or every mutation has to go through the same thing, whereas on the mRNA side you can encode the new virus, adapt the changes to the existing model, and then inject it or put it in the RNA, and then you're good to go. They also have a lot of high hopes with regards to multiple vaccinations for a single shot with regards to these mRNA things. And so what they're thinking is like you can get vaccinated for like 3 different things at one go, and then that reduces your overall risk, and it's just better for everybody. So that's positive, but it's untested from a vaccine perspective. And so we're all about to find out real quick and in a hurry how well it works. Luckily for us in the US, the UK has already started to distribute it, and Canada has already approved it. And so if they haven't already, they should be starting to distribute it soon. The only issue with that is that like we're not going to get years-long studies over the long-term effects of the vaccine until it's been years, and so that's just going to take time. Yesterday in the hearing for the for the emergency use authorization for the Pfizer drug, they were specifically bringing that up. Like, how are you going to track your participants to make sure, to measure the efficacy over a long period of time, and as well to make sure that there's no unintended long-term side effects. And so that's good, but at the same time, we're all kind of taking a leap of faith if we're going to jump right into this when there's no other options out there other than potentially the Pfizer vaccine. Lastly, I want to talk about the phase 1 rollout. So the U.S. has it's one phase, but it's 3 sub-phases, I guess is what you call them. And I wanted to kind of go through that because the current numbers that we have, even just in phase 1, are more than what's going to be available in the near future from a vaccine perspective. So with Pfizer, the U.S. has bought 100 million doses, which only means 50 million people get inoculated because it's a two-dose thing. And then we had the option to buy up to 500 million additional doses, but we passed on that earlier this week or late last week. I can't remember. And so that doesn't mean we won't get it or we won't get extra doses from Pfizer. It just means we get put in the back of the queue, whereas we had priority before. Now we don't. There's politics involved with that. I'm not getting into that. I'm also not getting into I'm not doing conspiracy theories with regards to viruses. Like, if you don't think vaccines are real, none of this applies to you at all. And so with that said, we don't have enough to make it through the full phases. And so here's how it goes. So phase 1A, they cleverly named this 1A, 1B, 1C. So through phase 1A, we're doing healthcare professionals, which is an obvious choice. They need to be the first people to get the vaccine because they've been dealing with this crap for months. I can't imagine. Like, I deal with it from a personal perspective, like in social distancing and things like that. But I'm not in it every day. Like, I don't envy them, and I very much appreciate the work they've put into things so far. And I feel that it's an obvious choice to have them included in the very first wave. The second group in the very first wave are people that live at long-term care facilities, so nursing homes, assisted living, and things like that. The reason they were included specifically is because they make up 6% of the total cases, but they make up 40% of the deaths. And so they're the most at-risk group as a whole, and so they're being included, and that makes sense. Phase 1B, however, to go back, phase 1A is 24 million people registered so far, with about 99% of the total healthcare industry registering. There's maps and stuff that show all that kind of stuff, but there's 24 million folks in that one, which leaves 26 million for the rest of everybody else. And 1B is a huge group because it includes police, firefighters, education, food and ag, utilities, corrections officers, and transportation. And so if you guys want to know if you want more detail on the specific phases and how things are going to roll out from a supply chain perspective, then let me know, and I'll try to make a video on that in the future that has a lot more detail. But that's a lot of people in phase 2 that are just not going to be able to get it. So we'll have to wait on either the Moderna drug to pass the EUA, or we'll have to wait for Pfizer to come back around with additional doses, pending Pfizer's approval to distribute. And so, again, it's the 11th of December, and it's not happened as of yet, but it's expected to happen tomorrow on the 12th. And then finally, we've got 1C, which are adults that are at risk because they've got medical conditions that compound COVID, so like diabetes and other things like that, as well as anybody over the age of 65. So if you're 65 or older, when you get to phase 1C, you will be included. And that's the way it stands as of right now. Now, once things get going, there's no telling how things are going to change, because if this works anything like the phased reopening plans that Nashville and Tennessee had, it'll last maybe a day or two before they start changing things up to better take care of their donors or constituency or whatever you want to call it. I think it's mostly donors or people that I'm not getting into that. Not getting into that. Anyways, so that's the phased approach. I would imagine that just to get through phase one, it's going to be a few months because there's so many people, and then the actual number of vaccines out there is relatively low compared to where it will be in late Q2, early Q3 of 2021, because hopefully by then there will be multiple manufacturers producing multiple vaccines, and maybe we'll have a choice or maybe we won't. And either way, we'll find out at the time. You guys have a good weekend, and we'll talk to you next time.